This experience of being with you for these 2 days has shaken up some more of my categories. I think one of the things that the Lord is continually doing is shaking up my categories. And in the States, for some reason, the people in the southern part, where the warm climate is, have the reputation of being the warm people, and we who live in New England have the reputation of being the cold ones. Well, if New England is cold, I'm sure that Alberta is colder, but the people don't fit that description at all. In fact, I would say that your warmth and hospitality have certainly rivaled what we call southern hospitality. And Lars and I were remarking on the fact that I don't think we've passed a single student on the campus that hasn't spoken to us. And that's unusual. We do visit a number of campuses, and usually students go by as if you were a lamppost or something. So thank you. Thank you for your warm response. I want to mention just one thing that's back there afterwards, if you want to pick it up. A yellow card which you can sign with your name and address if you would like to get some free sample copies of my newsletter. I have a newsletter that comes out every other month, 6 times a year, and we will put your name on the list, and you can receive it a few times, and then you will receive a card which you must return in order to let us know whether you want to continue to receive it or whether you'd like to get your name off the mailing list. And we will certainly try to guarantee that your name will be taken off if you want it to be, because if you're anything like us, you don't want a lot of junk mail. But if you want to fill out the card, you can leave it there and save yourself a stamp, or you can take it home and decide whether to fill it out later and then mail it in. My topic tonight is servanthood. And I wanted to start out with a story about my second husband. But I know that there are some people here who are going to be thinking, that poor man back there, Lars Gren, he has to sit and listen to all these stories about husband number 1. Don't tell me she's going to talk about husband number 2 tonight when he's husband number 3. Well, I am. And you can relax because Lars knows all these stories. In fact, he tells some of them himself. And he is not the least bit uptight about it. In fact, he did say one time that he was getting a little tired of hearing from number 1 and number 2 when number 3 never got quoted. And he said, one of these days I'm going to say something quotable. But then he said, on second thought, considering the price that they had to pay to get quoted, I think I'll keep my mouth shut. Anyhow, husband number 2, Addison Leach, who used to write for Christianity Today, he was Eutychus II, and he also wrote a column called Current Religious Thought, was the dean of a college in Pennsylvania. And on one occasion it was reported to him that there was peanut butter and shaving cream all over the walls of a certain men's dormitory. I certainly hope I don't put any new ideas into your heads. But obviously the dean had to do something, so he went over to the dormitory and began knocking on doors. And predictably, there wasn't a solitary soul in the dormitory that had the least idea how this could have happened. There it was, shaving cream and peanut butter all over the walls. Well, he had a couple of choices. He could ask the janitor to do it, and they had a very good custodian, a very willing man who had been with them for years and would do anything that was asked. But my husband felt that this was way beyond the call of duty, and he didn't want to ask him to do something like that. Second choice would be to insist that every man in the dormitory come out and start cleaning it up. But he took the third possibility, which was to get a bucket and a brush himself and start scrubbing the walls. And it was amazing, the effect that that had. Doors began to open, heads began to pop out, and the sight of the dean scrubbing the walls was a little bit too much for some of the men, and pretty soon they were pitching in and helping. The power of servanthood. G.K. Chesterton said, "We are taller when we bow." And Jesus certainly demonstrated that truth. At the same occasion, when he assumed the lowest place of the lowest slave in an Eastern household and washed the disciples' feet. You remember that it was right then that he said to them, "Ye call me Master and Lord, and ye say, well, for so I am." He was not abdicating his position as their master by being a slave. He was showing what real servanthood is about. We are taller when we bow. My talks have been under the heading, "At Your Disposal, Lord." And we spoke yesterday morning on who is your master, last night on the authority of Christ, this morning on making truth visible, and tonight on servanthood. A servant is at his master's complete disposal. The servant is not the one who dictates the terms. It's the master who dictates the terms. It's the master who chooses the job. It's the master who determines the pay. I'm become very concerned nowadays when I see how little spirit of servanthood there is among Christians. If Christians are not prepared to be servants, I don't know who is. Don't misunderstand me. There are a lot of people who talk about wanting to serve the Lord. But very often, if you probe a little bit, you find out that they really do want to dictate the terms. They want to serve the Lord in a particular way. They want to serve the Lord in a particular place or under certain conditions. They would like to do something which is recognizable, something that has a title perhaps, or a degree, or a name attached to it, something for which they will receive credit. I have a friend who, after they had been married for a couple of weeks, was asking himself one afternoon when his wife was out shopping, now what can I do for her that will really blow her mind and prove to her that I really do love her? And he came up with the brilliant idea of scrubbing the kitchen floor. And he thought that was really above and beyond the call of duty. And he was sure that it would be a delightful surprise, and she would heap praise on him. And so he got down on his knees and he scrubbed the floor. After a while, he heard the car come in, and she came breezing into the kitchen with her arms full of grocery bags, dumped the bags on the counter, and looked down at the floor, and she said, "Oh, the floor is clean. Thank you, honey," and went about putting groceries away. Well, my friend Joe said, I went into a 3-day funk. He said, I was so hurt and so angry that she didn't recognize what a sacrifice I had made. He had never heard of a man scrubbing a kitchen floor. What he didn't know was that she was reared in a family where only men scrubbed floors. She'd never heard of a woman scrubbing one. Her father had always done it. And so she took it for granted. He had come from a home where his mother had always done it. And he told me that he had put up in his kitchen and also in his study the motto from that verse that we read yesterday, "When you have done all, you are still an unprofitable servant. You have done only that which was your duty to do." And there's not really very much of the spirit of servanthood among us. I'd like you to stop and think for a moment of who you know among your Christian friends that you could call upon to do anything at all, and he or she would not ask for the credit. How many people do you know in your church that you could call on and say, ask her, she'll do it, she'll do anything? It seems to me that a Christian ought to be the kind of a person of whom it could be said, ask him, he's a Christian, he'll do anything. Nothing is beneath him. We live near a college and a seminary, and we live in a very wealthy town. And many of those college and seminary students get what they call live-ins. situations where they can live in some of these beautiful mansions for service in return. Some of them have complete carriage house apartments overlooking the ocean. Some of them have beautiful apartments in the houses themselves. We know one couple that had a 4-room apartment with a balcony overlooking the ocean. And I've talked to some of these people, some of these students, and I've found out that some of them have actually been offended because they were treated like servants, and they really expected to be treated like family. Well, these wealthy people are used to having servants, and they have a certain attitude toward them, and after all, it stands to reason that a servant has a well-defined place in the home, and that place is not the same as a son. Jesus said that he called us servants, but now we were called sons, and there is a difference. And I've tried to talk to some of these students about the fitness and propriety of their being asked to come in the back door and go up the back stairs and not expect to be introduced to the host and hostess's friends at the table. And some of them have taken umbrage at this and felt that this was very unjust and very undemocratic. And I didn't seem to be able to get to first base on this question of what real Christian servanthood ought to be, quite apart from the whole social scene of levels of upstairs and downstairs and master and servant. What about the Christian principles involved? Even if you don't understand the social categories of the wealthy people of Massachusetts, you ought to be able to understand the categories that Jesus has laid down so clearly for us in the Scripture. Who wants to serve anybody nowadays? We'd rather have a job that carries some kind of prestige. There are so many people wanting college educations and then wanting graduate degrees. They're obviously going to want professional jobs and white-collar jobs, and they don't want blue-collar jobs, and I just begin to wonder who in the world is going to do the plumbing and the fixing of things in another generation or so. Servanthood means submission. It means the acceptance of a low place. It means the recognition of authority. It means the willingness to suffer. It means the willingness to bear silently. I got those out of 1 Peter 2, not out of my head. 1 Peter 2, verses 18 to 23. Servants, accept the authority of your masters with all due submission, not only when they are kind and considerate, but even when they are perverse. For it is a fine thing if a man endure the pain of undeserved suffering, because God is in his thoughts. What credit is there in fortitude when you have done wrong and are beaten for it? But when you have behaved well and suffer for it, your fortitude is a fine thing in the sight of God. To that you were called, because Christ suffered on your behalf and left you an example. It is for you to follow in his steps. I think Peter was speaking to those who were the servant class, and speaking of how a Christian servant was to respond to a master, whether that master was a Christian or a non-Christian, whether he was kind or unkind. But the principles would certainly apply to all of us as we try to serve one another. We don't serve a person because we're going to be thanked. We don't serve them because they appreciate what we do or are going to give us a medal for it, but for the sake of Christ. And if we do suffer in the attempt to serve, and I'm sure most of us who have tried to help somebody at some time or other have found ourselves in a mess. We get involved in people's lives out of unselfish motives, and we find ourselves sometimes kicked in the teeth or involved in things that are far too deep for us, and we get hurt, and we feel very put out and put upon and unappreciated. And we need to go back to this kind of scripture. If you have behaved well and suffer for it, your fortitude is a fine thing in the sight of God. To that you were called. That is what Christians were called to. Christians are people that can be sinned against. Christians are never in a hurry, somebody has said. Christians are people who can wait. Servants often have to wait. I can remember when I was a child visiting in Bar Harbor, Maine, a very fancy resort, and going to a very fancy restaurant with a lady who had a chauffeur. And I remember that she and my mother and I walked in one door of the restaurant, and her chauffeur walked in another one, and there was a whole line of Cadillacs with chauffeurs sitting in them, waiting. And I was amazed to think of how much time those people must spend waiting. Are you the kind who leans on the horn the very second the light turns because the person in front of you hasn't started in the first half second? They say the shortest measurement of time is the time between the changing of the green light and the man behind you blowing his horn. Servants are people who are willing to bear silently. And I'd like to say a word to men tonight about what it means to be obedient to Jesus Christ. In America, in the United States, I really feel that what is called a women's issue is most emphatically a men's issue. We are in a terrible mess. We have been ever since the Garden of Eden, when the roles which God had assigned to men and women were reversed, and Eve became an initiator and Adam became a responder. But things have gotten much worse in the last couple of decades because of a lot of nonsense about equality and interchangeability. And women have been screaming louder and louder, and there is a very strong group of seemingly intelligent women who are cowing everybody into thinking that we ought to quit talking about men and women and masculine and feminine and male and female and talk about persons. And men have bought this. Now, I don't want to sock it to you too vehemently tonight because I'm a guest in a foreign country. I really don't know what your situation is here. Maybe it's not nearly as bad as it is in the States. But I have a strong hunch that there is some of this here too. And I really believe that the obedience which pertains to a man, obedience to Christ, means his willingness, for one thing, to accept authority. And because of the mess that was made back in the Garden of Eden, we women are always trying to run things. And you men are always taking a back seat and letting us do this. I don't know whether anybody here believes in purgatory, and I'm not going to say that I do, but I do get very amused when I read C.S. Lewis's view of purgatory. He envisioned it in one of his books as a place where crockery is always smashing, milk is boiling over, and toast is burning. That sounds like purgatory to me. But, he said, the lesson which is set to the women in purgatory is to do nothing. And the lesson to the men is to do something. If the crockery is smashing, the milk is boiling over, and the toast is burning, of course we women are the ones who are always expected to do something about it. And we're always doing something about things that are none of our business. And a lot of times when I talk to women about what goes on in the church and the way women are running the prayer meetings and running the Sunday school and running this and running that, they always tell me that they have to do it because the men won't. And of course the men don't do it because the women do. And the truth is that we are a bunch of miserable offenders. I have a hunch that the reason that men don't really want to be servants in the Christian sense is that it does involve sacrifice and it involves humility. It's not bossism. It's not tyranny. It's not lording it over women or grinding us under your heel. It says in Ephesians 6 that the husband is supposed to love his wife as Christ loved the church. And that means that he gave himself for her. A man's obedience to his master is in acceptance of the servanthood assigned to him as the representative of Christ in the church and in the home. I haven't got very much time to mention this tonight. I just wanted to mention these two examples of servanthood as they apply to us women and you men by way of illustration of one thing in which we need to learn what servanthood is. But the whole masculinity and femininity debate and the mess which we've made in our homes and in the church, I believe are far more serious than a mere matter of equality or competition or interchangeability, things about which we can perhaps shrug or sometimes be amused and take seriously or casually as we choose. To me, there is a far more serious mistake here, and that is our violating the mystery of Christ and the church. The only reason that a husband is called the head of the wife is because God has assigned him an office which he holds in the home. He represents Christ in that home. And the woman is to submit to him not because she is stupid or less spiritual or physically weaker, but because she represents the church. And the church's role is submission. So rule and submission are divinely appointed assignments. They are not achievements. And where the mystery of Christ and the church is at stake, we tamper with that arrangement to our peril. To be the authority requires servanthood. Are you prepared, you men, to lay down your lives in the church and in the home? Are you willing to pay the price that Jesus Christ paid in order to be Lord and Master? And I would say to you women that our obedience to Jesus Christ will be represented by our submission to those whom God has put over us. If we're married, we know that we have a head, and it's not a choice. It's not a matter of working things out according to our preferences and our tastes and our intellectual abilities, but accepting with gratitude, with joy, and with humility a divine assignment, accepting the gift of our femininity in a willingness to glorify God by being women. Submission means the acknowledgement of authority. There's an interesting verse in 1 Chronicles. It says that David's men submitted to him and gladly made him king. And it seems to me that's a good expression of what submission is. We gladly make our husbands our heads. Not that we can make them that, they have already been assigned to that position, as David was anointed king. But the men gladly accepted his kingship, and that's what a woman is supposed to do. A husband lays down his life for his wife. He sacrifices to make her perfect, to make her spotless, as Christ did for his bride. And the woman, in her willingness to acknowledge her head, is to demonstrate something that never comes naturally to me, and I have a sneaking suspicion it doesn't come naturally to very many of you women. What Peter calls a gentle and quiet spirit. There isn't any of that in me naturally, not an atom. It has to be a work of grace. Servanthood. Is it a desire to serve the Lord, or is it a desire for recognition that we really have? Very often I'm afraid that desire to serve the Lord is camouflaging an ambition to have a particular kind of ministry. When I went to live with the Auca Indians back in 1958, this was nearly 2 years after my husband was killed, I had prayed a very rash prayer. I had told the Lord that if he wanted me to do anything about the Aucas, I would go, I would do it, thinking I was very safe in a prayer like that, because I couldn't imagine that there was anything that a woman with a baby, a widow with a baby, could do when 5 young, strong men had been killed in their attempt. But through an amazing series of circumstances, the Lord showed me that that's exactly what I was to do. And so I went in with my daughter, who was 3 years old, and Rachel Saint, the sister of the pilot that I told you about this morning. And we lived with those Indians. I lived for 2 years with them. And I had some ideas about what I was going to do as a missionary. I ought to have known a little better than I did because I'd been working with Indians. I had been working with 2 other tribes before I went to the Aucas and had already had my categories shaken up a number of times. But I thought of going into the Aucas and reducing their language to writing. But I never thought of all the roles that were going to be required of me. I found out, for one thing, that I was a comedian to the Aucas. It never had occurred to me that I was a comedian in any way, shape, or form. But when I would walk across a clearing, they would imitate the way I walked, and they would accompany my footsteps with sound effects. Well, if you want to make your classmates feel stupid when they walk across the campus, stick your head out of the dorm window and accompany their footsteps with sound effects. And if everybody does it in unison, you know, that's even more ridiculous. And that's what they did. And everything that I tried to do, they made fun of. And they were always yelling out one phrase, which my daughter would often call out first. Ha-akam, which means, everybody listen to this. When I was trying to speak the Auca language, my daughter would say, ha-akam, because of course she had learned it in a matter of a few weeks, and here I was struggling along. And when they would try to get me to do things that any normal adult woman should be able to do, I would make a mess of them. They insisted that I try to make clay pots, and so of course I tried, and mine came out lopsided. Then they insisted that I try weaving a hammock, and I tried that, and I made a mess of that and got knots in it. Then they wanted to know if I could catch fish with my hands, and I said no. And they said, well, do you know how to plant manioc? And I said no. And do you know how to find wild honey? No. Can you do this? Can you do that? Well, what do you do? And of course I didn't do anything except walk around with a notebook and make marks. Well, what's that? And what's that for? And why are you doing that? And is that all you know how to do? And they could only conclude that I was retarded. Because any 10-year-old girl would be able to make a perfect clay pot, perfect hammock, catch fish with her hands. Valerie could catch fish with her hands. And she was fast learning to swing a machete, just like the women, cut grass, made it look just as if it had been mowed with a lawnmower. Incredible things. We'd go on the trail, and they would insist that I go first, just so they could laugh, because they would know that I was going to go off on an animal trail, not being able to distinguish an animal trail from a human trail. They could not imagine the stupidity. An animal trail looked exactly the same to me. Human trails in that part of the jungle were never more than about 6 inches wide, because they always walked with one foot straight in front of the other. And so do animals. So I couldn't see how they could distinguish between them. When I'd wake up in the morning, the first announcement that would be made in the clearing was, she's awake. And I would hear that echoed from house to house, all the way around the clearing, in case anybody had missed it. I never thought about the fact that I was going to go in there and be not a benefactor, not a white woman that had all kinds of marvelous things to offer them, as missionaries sometimes are, but a comedian, a retarded child, deaf. They were always coming up and wanting to examine my ears. What's the matter with your ears? Don't you have any holes in them? Can't you hear anything? Why can't you speak this language? I was a giant. I was a head and shoulders taller than the tallest woman, head taller than the tallest man. They thought the color of my skin was pitiful. They said, your eyes are like jaguars. Your hair looks like palm fiber. One day I was sitting in my house, and the house had no walls, and nobody else's house had any walls either, and there was an older woman sitting in the house next to mine, and she was cooking, and she yelled out, Gikari, go get me some water. Well, she had a clay pot there, a big, huge clay pot with no handles. And I had to go down a very slippery, very steep, muddy bank to the river with this pot and fill it up and try to get back up the bank without smashing the pot to pieces and falling. And it was a neat trick. I really wasn't very good at that. But there was no question that I had to do this because I was a younger woman, and any older woman in the Auca tribe had a perfect right to ask younger women to do things, to order them to do things. They didn't ask, they didn't have any word for please. It was just, go get me some water. And you went and got it. And I began to realize that a missionary is quite literally a servant. I knew that, of course, in theory. I knew that the missionary ought to be prepared to serve the Indians, and I thought I was, and I had in various ways. I had done medical work and literacy work and translation work and done a lot of visiting and given a lot of shots, a lot of injections and a lot of worm medicine and delivered a lot of babies and all kinds of things like that, which fit very neatly into my categories of what missionaries are supposed to do. But I had never thought of the fact that an Indian might be ordering me around like a servant and telling me what to do. There's a wonderful lesson in the 9th chapter of 1 Chronicles. It's the listing there of the various categories into which the people of Israel were divided up. It talks about the priests and the Levites, and it gives the names of the leaders of the families. And then it talks about the doorkeepers. And there were 212 doorkeepers as opposed to 1,760 priests. We can't all be priests. Some of us have got to be doorkeepers. And it says here, those picked to be doorkeepers numbered 212 in all, registered in their hamlets. David and Samuel the seer had installed them because they were trustworthy. I wonder how many of us are trustworthy. Are you the kind of person to whom a job can be given and you know that it will be done? The other person knows that it will be done. Or are you the kind of person that has to be checked up on and reminded and prodded and hurried and begged and pleaded? Would you mind doing this for a little while? Could you just take somebody's place for just this weekend? Would it be too much trouble? Would it be asking too much? What kind of thanks are you going to demand? These were chosen because they were trustworthy. And their responsibility was to have charge of the key for opening the gates, charge of the vessels used in the service of the temple, charge of the furniture, the sacred vessels, the flour, the wine, the oil, the incense, and the spices. Terribly practical things. Servants. Are you willing to be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord, or would you rather dwell in the tents of the wicked? Who is it that's willing to do the job that nobody is going to notice? One of the things that I find deeply upsetting in the feminist movement is the pressure on women to get out of the house and to do what is claimed to be interesting work, fulfilling work. I recently read an article written by the Christian wife of the Christian president of a Christian college, and she talked about how she never found fulfillment at home taking care of her children, and she's so glad now that her children are gone that she can get out and get a job in the working world where there's fulfillment. My heart breaks when I think of the young women who, before God, feel a responsibility to stay home and take care of their children, and they're being pressured by society and even by Christian husbands and by the church to get out, put the kids in a daycare center, get a job. We have commercials on the TV that I see back there in Boston. This woman comes on and she says, if there's one job I hate, it's cleaning toilets. And you know what? I don't clean them anymore. And then she tells about this blue stuff that she puts in the tank and she doesn't have to clean the toilet. Well, now I'm not saying there's anything wrong with putting the blue stuff in the tank. I happen to be one of those freakish women who adores housework. I like to clean toilets. But the point is, there is pressure, continuous pressure against women to regard everything that has been regarded as women's work, traditional work, as disgusting and degrading. And any intelligent woman is going to get out of it if she possibly can and let somebody else do it. Who in God's name is going to do it? Who in God's name is going to do the dirty jobs in the church? in the home unless there are servants. Unless there are people who are willing to do the job that will not be noticed. You know what women's work has always been. It's been work that nobody notices if we do it, but everybody notices if we don't do it. We're to be servants. Wash feet. Minister. This word ministry has gotten to be a terribly high-flown name, but it really doesn't mean one single thing in the original except service. Servanthood. The Lord's given you such a wonderful ministry, people say. What do they mean? When they're talking to me, they mean writing books or speaking. But I say with all my heart that I do not believe that I am serving God more faithfully and effectively by standing up here and talking to a group of people like you than I am when I am cleaning a toilet, provided I'm doing that job as an offering to Jesus Christ. I'm the same person, exactly the same person, whether I'm sitting at the typewriter or cooking a meal. God knows I'm the same person. And God knows that if I stand up here and speak to you without charity, it's nothing but sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. If I give my body to be burned, I'm nothing without love. And the same thing is true of the jobs that all of us have to do, whether your job is housework, office work, schoolwork, whatever it is. If you make it an offering to Jesus Christ, that transforms it into Christian work. Otherwise, there is no such thing as Christian work. There are not jobs which are Christian. A Christian plumber is not a plumber who uses Christian tools or deals with Christian drains. He is a Christian who does his work for God. A Christian writer is not a writer who limits himself to particular subject matter. That's not the way I look at it. My field is the world, but I bring to my subject matter a Christian faith. I look at it as a Christian. When I clean house, I ought to do a faithful and thorough job because I'm a Christian. I'm not doing it just for Lars, just for myself, just for pride, but for Jesus Christ. Philippians 2 is the definitive passage. Let your bearing towards one another arise out of your life in Christ Jesus. For the divine nature was his from the first, yet he did not think to snatch at equality with God, but made himself nothing, assuming the nature of a slave. Bearing the human likeness, revealed in human shape, he humbled himself, and in obedience accepted even death on a cross. Therefore, note the connection. Because he became a slave, God raised him to the heights and bestowed on him the name above all names, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven, on earth, and in the depths, and every tongue confess Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Let this mind be in you. Let your bearing toward one another arise out of your life in Christ Jesus. Are you willing to be a slave, a doorkeeper, a bellhop, a chambermaid? I'd like to close with a poem by Amy Carmichael, who was certainly a servant, missionary to India. This poem was one that Jim Elliot used to quote very often, even back in his college days when he would go out on a gospel team and speak about missions. The title is No Scar. Hast thou no scar? No hidden scar on foot or side or hand? I hear thee sung as mighty in the land. I hear them hail thy bright ascendant star. Hast thou no scar? Hast thou no wound? Yet I was wounded by the archers, spent, leaned me against a tree to die, and rent by ravening beasts that compassed me, I swooned. Hast thou no wound? No wound, no scar, yet as the master shall the servant be. But pierced are the feet that follow me, but thine are whole. Can he have followed far who has nor wound nor scar? God bless you.
On behalf of the North American Baptist College and Divinity School community, I would like to extend our sincere thanks, Elisabeth, for what you've shared with us in these past 2 days, for the verbal challenge that you've given to us, but more than that, for the challenge of your life and the way the Lord has worked through you and has ministered to us in that way.